How many times have you heard someone say, board games aren't political, they're just games? Well, in this episode, we're going to talk about how games are cultural, political, and persuasive products. Board games are embedded with, quote, not so subtle, ideological, moral, or national ideals as the object of the game. And that's Andriesse, 2018. Like any other socially constructed technology or product, games are, quote, saturated with racialized, gendered, sexualized, and national meaning. And that's Leonard, 2006. Board games, like any other cultural practice, are steeped in the values and beliefs of their creators. Magie, the original creator of what later became the mass-market consumer game Monopoly, had a set of ideas to share. For her, the game was an essay, a polemic, a means to educate the populace. Magie devised the Landlord's game to argue for a new system of taxation by instilling in players a sense of unfairness that is inherent in a system of property ownership that enriched wealthy property owners, many of them owning entire neighbourhoods, and penalized renters. In some cases, board games have been created for overt religious or political purposes. The mainstream game staple Snakes and Ladders was originally derived from an Indian game, designed to teach Jain and Hindu religions or moral beliefs. La Jeu de la Révolution Française, created by members of the French Revolutionary Force and printed in 1791, was designed to share the history of the French Revolution. The Game of Life was based on the Mansion of Happiness in 1800. It was a Christian morality game that included lines like, whoever becomes a Sabbath breaker must be taken to the whipping post and whipped. The Soviet Union issued a series of board games, The Abandoned, and this was a game about rounding up homeless children with the goal of bringing them to an orphanage to be cared for. Another game, Tuberculosis, A Proletarian Disease, and Look After Your Health, The New Hygiene, were designed to teach newly urbanized rural citizens about health and safety. Another Soviet game, created in 1926, Healthy Living, was designed to educate the citizenry about the dangers of alcoholism, sexually transmitted diseases, and folk healers. Players who consulted with a folk healer or fraternized with an unfamiliar woman could wind up at the cemetery or catching syphilis, respectively. The U.S. Central Intelligence Agency created board games designed to train agents to deal with global crises. The SXSW collection, designed by CIA analyst David Klopper, was designed to train agents in intelligence collection and provide exposure to the challenging juggling of multiple problems before each global challenge, quote, boils over. As such, board games have a long tradition of being used as instructive, persuasive, and ideological tools to teach morality, health and hygiene, religious concepts, social graces, political beliefs, historical accounts, and were essentially becoming vehicles for designers to share their beliefs, values, ideas, and biases. Like any of the fine arts, literature, film, games are a means for designers to express joys, anger, fears, confusion, affection, and hope. Like digital games, board games, too, are instances, just as Bogost said, of procedural rhetoric, allowing the player to get to, quote, the heart of things by mounting arguments about the process inherent in them. Designers, through the mechanics of play and the repetition of actions and behaviors, are giving players an experience. Designers influence player behavior, and procedural rhetoric helps to deepen the designer's message, providing an interactive journey that can make the player feel boredom, frustration, delight, fear, or outrage. The choice of game mechanics, themes, the ludologies, and the narratologies of the games are themselves all acts of persuasion. They are. The designer's selection of the processes and systems in the game is an editorial choice, and therefore, the game designer has a power to create powerful, effective, and cognitive experiences for a player. Board game designers are, in a very real sense, programming the formalized interactions of their human players. They are inculcating players with values and ideas. Thus, this research exercise that I underwent, that examines who designs and who gets to design board games, is a critical cultural and scholarly exercise. I still have to convince people in the academy that it is. This discussion helps us to understand what is lost and what is at stake when exclusion happens to a given business, hobbyist, or cultural pursuit. Why are games so important? I'll tell you. Some in the academy are quick to dismiss games as a serious area of study. And I get it from the hobbyist community too. It's just a game. These discourses often fill board game forums. Board games are so much more than idle, meaningless pastimes. And I think you and I both know that. If you're listening to this podcast, you probably already believe as I do. They're essential. They're important. The ability to access board games and board gaming has critical importance to society. I believe this fundamentally. And I want to look at why gameplay is so important for communities and individuals, and why board gaming plays a critical role and can play an even more important role in creating literacies in certain publics. What are the affordances of gameplay? And that's basically what are some of the benefits and features of board gameplay. I'm going to look at that. Why is this specific form of play, board gaming, so important? And answers to this question ranged from health benefits of direct human interaction to board gaming's overall ability to teach 21st century competencies. What do board games do for us? How does board game play help and enrich society and human lives? For the purposes of my research, I want to look at what is lost when certain publics or communities can't or don't have access to and the ability to play and create board games. And speaking about digital and game experiences, Richard and Gray Denson in 2018 argued that gaming holds, quote, promise for learning and socialization. Games have been called, quote, specialized tool-mediated, unquote, forms of intelligent human action and are therefore indispensable for human flourishing. And that's DeCastle and Jensen, 2007. In general, games and gaming, both analog and digital, have been correlated to improved learning outcomes. Game and gameplay offer affordances or benefits that include opportunities for learners to participate in what's called experiential or active learning. You experience the play in an embodied way. And that's called situated cognition, sort of in the moment you're play acting. You can engage in consequence-free experimentation and free play, a freedom from the everyday, which is often called the magic circle of games. Gameplay and games are also helpful as ways to encourage identity creation and exploration. They help to promote social cohesion and closeness, and improve overall individual well-being, including the release of stress. Games-literate learners can learn dynamically about complex systems, problem-solve in simulated environments, and apply information to experiences effectively. All kinds of researchers and theorists have linked gameplay to key 21st century skills, such as situated learning, collaboration, distributed cognition, working in a team, critical thinking, crowdsourcing ideas and problem solving, increasing motivation, helping with systems thinking, and adaptive reasoning. In game-based literacies, there is a semiotic sort of symbology layer of symbols and meaning and programmed player behavior that one must decode. In much the same way one might learn a foreign language or pick up the customs of a new community. Games literacy developed through the gestural and procedural language of games allow players to progress. However, without that understanding, players cannot journey into the heart of the game. Without a very patient guide, a teacher, or a human community of supportive helpers, some games are destined only to be played and enjoyed by a very closed group of affinity groups, a clique, a group that doesn't want anybody else to join. And it's available only to those people with that capacity to have that foreign language to read the game. These affinity groups often share intersectional, social, cultural, economic commonalities and other literacies common to that social group. And so that semiotic, linguistic, and procedural signifiers within the game that are required to unlock the secret of that game are often significant hurdles to overcome for those who have not yet attained these literacies. In board gaming, this is significantly more of a challenge than digital gaming, as a group of fellow gamers are required to play the game. This same design grammar, the structure, rhythms, norms, semiotic meanings, the symbols within the games, and other types of games are required literacies for the knowledge economy. Learning and knowledge production is not simply storing some disconnected facts in one's head and applying abstract rules to dynamic human situations. Learning happens in a wider context, embodied and situated in reality, acting and reacting, and garnering more information from feedback. Games-based literacy and learning provides dynamic, situated, deeply contextual learning. It can help create learners who can more effectively respond to the complexity of our rapidly changing world. There is a complex and layered understanding that is required to master games. So much so that gaming literacy has been called, quote, a multiplicity of literacies, and that's Guy, 2005. As games-based learning increases in popularity in our educational institutions and in our corporate training contexts, there is a growing field of research that suggests that learning and academic outcomes were better for those learners who had previous extensive experience with games. It has also been argued that games-based learning can provide students with the next level of literacy required to contend with and understand the multimodal digital and cultural content we are confronted with daily. Games of all kinds have played a key role in the creation of identity through the creative liminal spaces that allow players to carve out their lives. Players can enjoy, through the affordances and benefits of games, transformative acts of identity creation, trying on new personas and allowing gamers to have new experiences in that low-penalty experimental game state. Nakamura in 2000 called video games in cyberspace kind of identity tourism, which I love that so much. Board games and video games become simulations of worlds and problem spaces for the accomplishment of desired outcomes that might be outside our own specific perspectives and worldviews. And that's so essential with gaming. You're going elsewhere, you're meeting new people, you're trying on a different identity. And that's the great part about gaming. You can try on other personas, perspectives, and allow individuals to create and construct identity. Writing about tabletop games in the game Shadowrun, Merriman 2017 discusses the opportunity for players to, quote, become someone other than themselves. It provides a space for roleplay and for players to try on alternate identities, even as Merriman notes that Shadowrun's gameplay and character building tended toward quite prescriptive experiences, with a focus on a constructed character with challenges in the game world, rather than allowing more free play, and an exploration of the player's own identity. Gaming can take us out of that potentially blinkered and compartmentalized perspective and into the lives and systems of others that we might not encounter in our day-to-day realities. Games can act as models or miniaturized systems, enhancing a person's ability to view problems from that isometric God's eye view of complex systems and dynamics. And they help people analyze, interrogate, and experiment with solutions, broadening empathy and building social systems literacy. Abt, in 1970, he's the author of a great book about serious games, notes that the impulse to play games comes to us as children, playing with models of human processes such as dolls, toy houses, and that these processes can help to later assume adult roles in life. Games-based identity play occupies a key role in the formation of self, and helps individuals understand their place in a wide social context. Thus, my research exercise focused on representation in artwork and games is an important one. Limited or absent representation might play a role in limiting would-be players' ability to see themselves in the world, develop an understanding of possible identities, learn the skills they need to navigate an increasingly complex world, and to find that place of their own in the world. And we know, as gamers, if you're listening to this, that games are neither isolating, sedentary, or solitary, and that's an argument Isbister makes in 2016. Indeed, as she argues, games connect us, get us moving, allow us to form communities, and solidify social bonds. All of these factors help to experience emotional connection and empathy via games. In testing focused on the impact of multiplayer digital game experiences, players' galvanic skin responses, or GSR, are recorded demonstrating how playing in a room with friends is an even more pleasurable experience. This is a quote from Isbister. When players in a room get together, laugh, jump, tease each other, the power of games to drive connection, empathy, and closeness appears right before your eyes. Board game enthusiasts often report that they're drawn to face-to-face interactions missing in digital gameplay. Of traditional board game play, Donovan, 2017, says that board gaming has affordances many crave. And this is a quote. I think board games do have that social side, that face-to-face bringing people together aspect that's fairly unique. Video games are their obvious rival. They connect people online, but you don't get the body language. You don't get the eye contact. You lose a lot of that communication. There's something about board games bringing us together around a table, everyone focused on that task, not distracted by what's happening on social media or on their phone. Everyone's focused on that game, playing together, and seeing the whites of each other's eyes. Board games are also the means to escape the grind of the everyday. Game designer Bruce Barrymore Halpenny once said, board game play provides people with a way to release tension because, quote, most jobs are boring and repetitive. Sociologist Graham Kirkpatrick has suggested that we are being driven to computer and console games by a deep dissatisfaction with the state of neo-capitalist labor markets, unhappy with our precarious gig-based economy. McLuhan, back in the 60s, argued similarly. Not only did he say that board games were a cultural artifact, a product of their cultures, but games were a way to cope with the complexities of life and a means for dealing with the tension of modernity. With McLuhan writing, quote, games are dramatic models of our psychological lives. McLuhan said games, like institutions, were, quote, extensions of the social man or woman or non-binary person. In the same way, technologies are extensions of the human animal organism. There are significant social stakes when exclusion happens in products and spaces, and the knock-on effects have long-reaching implications. And that's my feeling. And here's some examples of that exclusion zone playing out. So, unfortunately, girls, women, Black, Indigenous, persons of color, other systematically marginalized communities do not always have equal access to, and at times, necessary game literacies to engage with and enjoy games. While there's a demonstrable need for multimodal games literacy, as argued earlier, many North American communities don't have equitable access to gaming spaces and the knowledge production possible through game play. There have been discourses throughout board game and digital gaming that women, BIPOC, LGBTQ+, gamers are not, quote, unquote, real gamers. And I always want you to remember, when anyone ever says, not real so-and-so, XYZ, whatever real is, be on high alert. That is always a tell. The argument goes that women are not necessarily interested in gaming, or worse, they're not capable of engaging with games. I've heard this a lot. These other identities that are not white men are often welcomed or not as, quote, outlier exceptions in communities dominated by a narrow stratum of human population, that moneyed, white, cisgendered, and straight male living in affluent nations, the real gamers, as the argument goes. The long-standing misconception that people who identify as women, BIPOC, LGBTQ+, are not interested in games has kept would-be gamers at the margins of gaming communities. In a very interesting board game geek thread that I found, there was a question, who, which is a mistake, women don't often play board games, unquote. And the replies to this question varied. Some comments were measured, saying there's more social pressure on women than men when it comes to pursuing the hobby, and it's less socially acceptable for women. Others disputed the fact that women aren't avid gamers, and someone said the number of women Mahjong, Bridge, and Bunko players alone probably outnumbers the number of Eurogamers and Wargamers from an order of 10, which is a very good point. This last comment is interesting, as it indicates the multitudinous categorizations of analog games and the resultant schisms within the analog gaming community, and the attitudes within these cultures that some types of games are better for women and girls than others. Still, other commenters suggested that women place their competitive drive into other areas of their lives. Quote, women might have a primal urge to distinguish themselves from others in a less aggressive way. This might be expressed in how much the average woman loves to shop for clothes, shoes, or buy makeup. This was a comment. As these discourses and comments signal, the white male gamer has long dominated the spaces where board gaming is practiced and discussed, and white men have often been assumed to be the default board gamer. Feminist game scholars have long observed a pattern of women and girls in gaming seen as, quote, passive, casual, or non-essential participants within a culture dominated by endless narratives of men and hegemonic masculinity. And that's Gray, Voorhees, and Vossen. As Ruberg and Shaw in 2014 observed, as with any community, there are a litany of, quote, unspoken norms, unquote, that are shared by a dominant and thereby more established members of the community. Members of that dominant group then seek to uphold and protect those norms, hold the access to game-based literacies tightly, and ensure their continued leadership through a variety of gatekeeping activities. As with any cultural pursuit, industry sector, or community of practice, eventually a language, a specialized literacy of the space develops, debates about authenticity and validity rage, and interlopers are often punished. Chess 2020 noted that gaming and gaming experiences have always seen masculinity at their center, while other identities ever present throughout the history of gaming occupied the margins. Throughout histories, board gaming spaces have been traditionally occupied by men. And why is that? There are deep historic roots in this belief system that still dominate some gaming cultures today. Classic analog board games such as chess, referred to frequently by Huizinga and Calois, have traditionally been the pursuit and sole preserve of gentlemen of social and economic privilege. In contemporary North American and European publics, there's an infamous image from that late 1960s edition of the mass-market game Battleship that depicts a father and son playing the game while the mom and daughter do the dishes in the kitchen, smiling indulgently at the playful menfolk playing the board game. Another classic board game, backgammon, was the focus of a celebrity craze in the 1970s and was popularized by Hollywood elites such as actors Roger Moore and Michael Caine, who were seen playing the game, themselves both archetypal representations of the cosmopolitan suave masculinity. The Playboy Mansion West in Los Angeles held backgammon tournaments until the wee hours of the morning, hosted by Hugh Hefner. Backgammon was marketed specifically and intentionally as a game for jet-setting, sophisticated men of action. One other miniature wargaming subculture formed in the late 1950s and 60s, and they were inspired in part by influences such as the H.G. Wells game manual called, and I'm not kidding about this, Little Wars, a game for boys from 12 years of age to 150, and for that more intelligent sort of girl who likes boys' games and books. That's the title. Published in 1913. In North America, tight-knit enthusiast communities formed around tabletop games such as Diplomacy, a backstabbing war game of political intrigue and negotiation, designed by Alan Kalhammer in 1958 and distributed commercially in 1960. Originally designed to be played through the postal mail by players all across the US, the Diplomacy zine and the postal play community grew to 31 different zines at its height, all run by white, middle-class men who had an interest in gaming and access to the at the time scarce technologies of carbon paper, this is a quote, ditto machines, mimeographs, or even a hectograph to produce these typewritten and pasted homemade zines. The once thriving and relatively widespread and predominantly North American community was broken apart by infighting and personality clashes, and its widespread fandom moved to other gaming communities in the 1980s, such as wargaming, serious games, and simulation communities, as well as other board gaming fandoms. And here's one of them. In 1971, Dungeons & Dragons, Gary Gygax created his own miniature wargaming system called Chainmail, which went on to later develop D&D in 1974. Trammell in 2020 traces the contemporary board game ethos and development of other contemporary board gaming communities to these early diplomacy and miniature wargaming groups. themselves linked to the military cultures of World War II, suburban white flight neighborhoods in the 50s and 60s, and close ties with the military-industrial complex. These games and their cultures were focused on offering complex statistical approaches to simulated war and insurgency suppression. A symbiotic and close relationship with the US military and early diplomacy zine publishers would result in the current staples of game design, such as the quantitative combat result tables, or CRTs, and allowing players to consider a wide range of factors when contemplating enemy combatants and their players' abilities. Wargame and strategy game designers of this era would pore over white papers from the RAND Corporation, a non-profit think tank concerned with matters of public safety and global stability, and whose largest clients are the Office of the U.S. Secretary of Defense, the U.S. Army, and the U.S. Air Force. These early communities were also predominantly white, middle class, and male with a militaristic bent, gaming in their white flight suburban homes with fellow like-minded players, and that played a pivotal role in the development of the contemporary board gaming cultures we experience today. During these formative times for board gaming, there were also early moves to welcome more players into the wider gaming, wargaming, and tabletop RPG or role-playing game hobby. One diplomacy zine publisher, or dipzine or dippy as they were often called, Leonard, waded into the D&D fandom and made some attempts to draw women into the male-dominated hobby. Lekofka, a former writer and editor for diplomacy fanzine Liaison Dangereux, wrote a guide for D&D players called, quote, Notes on Women and Magic, unquote. The guide, applying the same quantitative and statistical rigor required of diplomacy play, suggested that women could join D&D groups, but that female characters might elect to play, but could never level up or have superior strength statistics that would exceed the strength stats of male players in the fighter race category. Therefore, no matter what their achievements were in game, women characters would never be stronger than male counterparts. Yet Lekofka posited women characters might have increased dexterity, would have more talent with lockpicking because of their lighter builds and slighter fingers. In the 1976 Lekofka Guide, he provided a glimpse into the ways in which the predominantly white male gaming community imagined the bodies of women. And this is a quote from Trammell. As Trammell further notes, this guide often failed to make the core D&D rule books and the D&D second edition, and it didn't actually make the cut in either of those editions. And thereafter, quote, female players' characters had no mechanical disadvantage or advantage. So, Notes on Women in Magic was defended by practitioners then as now as an earnest attempt at introducing female players into what was at the time an exclusively male hobby. Arnotto in 2018 cited a 1977 article about the game Dungeon, a simplified D&D variant, and he wrote additional moves to bring women into the hobby. And this is a quote from Arnotto. The wary girlfriend or hostile wife who wouldn't touch a CRT combat result table with a 10-foot Panzerfaust may well enjoy moving through a maze and taking us on assorted trolls and hobgoblins. Despite efforts such as Lekofka, the white male dominance of board gaming has changed very little in the past 47 years. The gaming subculture still appears to be dominated by men. And in wargaming, in 2016, a poll conducted by the wargaming site Paxisms found that 99% of the readership were male. Thanks so much for listening to episode 8, Board Games Have Meaning. Or maybe Board Games Have Meaning. This is a very helpful episode when you ever have anyone in your life that tells you board games aren't political, they're just games. Send them this episode. Thanks so much for listening. I really do appreciate it. It means a lot to me. If you do like this podcast series, share it with a friend, like and subscribe. It will help my channel grow and do more of these episodes. I deeply appreciate you. I hope you're staying well. Thanks for listening and have a great day.